The hen house stood on stilts, 8 feet off the ground, right where the corn used to be. And every morning, without fail, 86 white hens walked up the same worn path to the same dry rise. Single file, unhurried, like they'd always known exactly where they were going. Maybe they had. I used to think I was the one who figured it out. The high ground, the way to survive what the river kept throwing at us. I spent a long time believing that. Then I realized the chickens figured it out first. I was just the last one to stop arguing with them. My name is Nora Calloway, and the summer I turned 26, a flood took everything we had built in 14 months of marriage. The corn, the savings, the plan. What it left behind was a crate of half-drowned chicks, a 3-acre hill nobody had ever wanted, and a sentence my husband's grandmother had said once quietly, the way old women say the things that matter most. The land tells you what it wants, but only if you stop telling it what you want first. I didn't understand it then. It took losing everything to finally hush long enough to hear it. This is the story of what the land was trying to say, and what 86 chickens understood long before I did. The land came with a warning, not the kind written on paper, not the kind a lawyer reads aloud in a quiet room while everyone stares at their hands. The warning came in a voice, soft and certain, the kind of voice that doesn't raise itself because it has never needed to. Nora heard it the day they buried Eli's grandmother. She was standing at the edge of the reception holding a plate of food she hadn't touched, watching Eli accept condolences from people whose names she was still learning. They had been married 11 months. She was still new to everything. The house, the land, the particular way grief moved through a family that didn't talk about it directly. Eli's grandmother had been 91 years old and sharp as a new fence post until the very end. Her name was Mabel, and in the last hour of that reception, when the room had thinned out and the food had gone lukewarm, and Nora was finally sitting down, Mabel's oldest friend pressed a dry hand against Eli's cheek and said something Nora almost missed. Almost. "The land tells you what it wants," the old woman said. "But only if you stop telling it what you want first. Most folks never hush long enough to hear." Eli nodded, the way young men nod at old wisdom. Polite, present, completely somewhere else. But Nora heard it. She turned it over in her mind the whole drive home, the way you turn a stone over to see what's living underneath. She didn't know what to do with it yet. She just knew it mattered. She tucked it away, and she kept going. The Calloway farm sat in the bottoms of the Missouri River Valley, just outside a small Nebraska town that showed up on maps but not on much else. 40 acres of black bottomland soil, so rich that the old-timers liked to say you could plant a fence post in April and harvest a barn by September. The land had been Mabel's. Now it was theirs. Eli had grown up knowing it would be, and that knowledge had shaped him the way river water shapes stone. Steady pressure. Long time. He was 28 years old and built like he'd been designed specifically for farm work. Wide shoulders, calloused hands. A jaw that set hard when he'd made up his mind about something which was often. Nora was 26 and had grown up in town. Her father kept a hardware store, her mother kept a garden and a tight set of opinions about how things ought to be done. Nora had learned from both of them, the practical and the precise, how to fix what was broken, how to keep careful track of what you had, which was why she was the one who kept the books. She knew at any given moment exactly how much they owed to the First Lending Bank of Harwick County, and exactly how many months of payments stood between them and breathing easy. The number was never as small as she would have liked. Mr. Holt, who managed their loan, had a talent for making routine check-ins feel like a hand closing slowly around your throat. Politely, professionally, but closing all the same. Eli didn't worry about the numbers the way Nora did. Eli believed in work, in the kind of sustained physical effort that turned problems into solved problems. He had drained the low corner of the east field himself, dug furrows straight as rifle shots, planted 40 acres of corn that stood knee-high and electric green by late May. It was good corn. It was going to be a good year. That was the general feeling in the Calloway house that spring. A young marriage, a good crop, a long summer stretching ahead. They were not wealthy. They were not comfortable in any way that allowed for ease. But they were working. They were together. And the corn was green. Their nearest neighbors were August and Winifred Pryor. August had farmed the bottoms for 30 years and had opinions about everything within a 10-mile radius, most of them concerning what younger farmers were doing wrong. He was 62 years old, with a face that had been weathered past the point of reading, and a voice that carried whether he intended it to or not. His wife, Winifred. Win. Everyone called her except August, who called her Fred when he was in a good mood, and nothing at all when he wasn't, was 58 and built for quiet, steady work. She brought things, preserves, cornbread. The occasional piece of information delivered so gently you didn't realize it was advice until you were already following it. Between the two farms ran a cart track worn smooth by decades of wagon wheels. Beyond Eli's far field rose a low hump of ground that nobody had ever done anything with. Too small to plow, too high to irrigate. 3 acres of wild sunflower and prairie grass and brambles so thick a fence post disappeared into them. Mabel had called it the knob. She had never once tried to clear it. Eli called it a waste and meant to do something about it eventually. Eventually meaning never. Nora had no strong feelings about it either way. She was busy with the house and the kitchen garden and the dozen laying hens and the books that never quite balanced to her satisfaction. The knob just sat there, patient, the way things that know something wait. The rains came early that spring and didn't leave. April was wet. May was wetter. The river, half a mile to the east, rose and held. Rose and held. Brown and wide and very, very patient. August Pryor came to the fence line one afternoon in late May and stood there squinting east. Eli was mending wire. Nora was hanging laundry on the far line close enough to hear. Snowpack in the mountains was the deepest in 20 years, August said. Eli kept working. Levee upstream will hold. August was quiet for a moment. Then he spat. Levee's just dirt, he said. Dirt that hasn't failed yet. He walked back toward his own place without another word. Eli finished mending the wire. Nora finished hanging the laundry. Neither of them said anything about it over dinner. But that night she lay awake and listened to the river. She couldn't actually hear it from the house. It was too far. But she thought she could feel it. That low, patient weight of water held back by nothing except distance and luck. She thought about what Mabel's friend had said. Hush long enough to hear. She fell asleep before she figured out what she was supposed to be listening for. The water came on a Tuesday night in early June. There was no warning anyone acted on. The sound was what woke them. 3 a.m, and the world outside had gone loud in a way that made no sense for a few seconds. Then the cold shock of it hit. Water. Under the door. Moving across the kitchen floor like it owned the place. Because it did. The river had always owned this land. They'd just been renting. Eli and Nora scrambled in the dark. No time for decisions. No time for anything except grabbing what was closest and moving up. They hauled what they could to the second floor. Eli's grandmother's trunk, the ledger books, a box of Nora's mother's letters, the cash money they kept in a tin above the stove because neither of them fully trusted banks with the important things. By the time gray light came through the upstairs window, there was nothing left to save. The corn was gone. 40 acres of knee-high green drowned under 4 feet of churning brown. The field had become a lake. Fence posts stuck up through the surface in uneven rows, marking where solid ground used to be. The smell was like something heavy and old and indifferent, like the river exhaling. They stood at the window together. They didn't speak for a long time. There was nothing to say yet that wasn't just noise. It was Nora who saw it first. A wooden crate, riding low in the water, moving with the slow spin of the current across what used to be the east field. And from inside it, cutting through the rush and roar of everything, came a sound. Thin, frantic, unmistakable, peeping, dozens of voices, tiny and terrified and alive. Eli, he looked where she was pointing. That's a chicken crate, he said. There are chicks in there. A pause. Nora. There are chicks in there, Eli. He looked at her, then at the crate, then at the water between them, and it, which was cold and fast, and chest deep at minimum. I'll get the rowboat, he said. He came back 20 minutes later, soaked to the sternum. The crate wedged across the bow of the little boat, and the sound coming from it had not stopped. Not once. They got it inside, up the stairs, into the bedroom where the floor was still dry and the light was better. Eli pried the lid and they both looked in. 86 chicks. Eli counted them twice that afternoon, which was the kind of thing he did when his mind needed somewhere to go that wasn't grief. They were maybe 4 weeks old, past the worst fragile stage, not yet grown, wet and matted and shivering and packed so tightly together that the warmth of their combined small bodies had kept the weakest ones from going under. They had saved each other. The smallest things saving each other. Nora lined a basket with rags and set it near the stove. And then she did something she couldn't have explained if anyone had asked. She picked up the first chick, wet yellow fuzz barely the size of her fist, trembling so hard she could feel its whole small heart. She wrapped it in a rag and held it until it stopped trembling. Then she set it in the basket and picked up the next one. She did this 86 times. Eli leaned against the doorframe and watched her. His corn was gone. The year was gone. The mortgage payment was due in August. August was 8 weeks away, and he had nothing. Absolutely nothing to show for 14 months of the hardest work of his life. And his wife was drying 86 chickens one by one like they were each individually precious. He opened his mouth. Nora, don't. Eli, don't. He closed his mouth. He watched her pick up the next one. He rubbed his face with both hands. He stared at the ceiling for a moment. Then he sat down on the floor with his back against the wall and watched his wife dry chickens with the focused attention of a woman who had decided this was the thing she was going to do, and nothing was going to interrupt her. The kitchen filled with the sound of peeping. The floor was covered in damp rags and damp newspaper. Outside, the water lapped against the stilts of the house. The chicks did not die. By evening, the basket was a riot of yellow and white and noise, and the beginnings of something almost like warmth. August Pryor came over the next afternoon. He was dripping from his own wade through the shallower section of the cart track. He stood in the doorway of the second floor, where they were living now, the whole floor belonging to them, since the first floor belonged to the river, and he saw the basket. He saw the chicks. His face did something complicated. How many? He said, not a question. The voice of a man preparing himself for bad news. 86, Eli said. A long pause. Drown them or sell them, August said, flat, direct, the way he said most things. I say it kindly. You two are about to be hungry. Those birds eat like 800 and they won't lay for months. You haven't got months. You've got weeks. There's a poultry buyer in town. Wynn's voice came from behind him. She'd followed at a distance and was standing a step back on the landing, quieter and drier, a jar of something in her hands. He'd give you a few cents a head. It's not much, but it's feed money. Eli looked at Nora. Nora looked at the basket. A few cents a head, Eli said that night. He had the pencil out, the ledger open, the lamp burning low because they were already thinking about lamp oil. "Call it $3 for the lot." $3. Against everything we lost. He set the pencil down. "Or we feed them through the summer on grain we don't have. Betting they'll lay come fall. Betting the river doesn't come back. Betting a lot of things we have no business betting." Nora sat across from him at the table. Outside, the water moved against the stilts with a slow rhythmic sound. Patient as ever. "Mabel kept hens through the flood of '81, she said. Eli waited. "She used to say a hen knows where to stand when the water comes." Nora was quiet for a moment. "I never knew what she meant." "She was old," Eli said, gently. "Sometimes old people say things that sound like they mean more than they do." Nora looked at him. She thought about the woman at the reception. The dry hand on Eli's cheek. The particular weight of that voice. "1 week," she said. "Give me 1 week, then we decide." The water fell faster than it had risen. 4 days, and the lake had drained back toward the river, leaving behind a ruin of stinking black mud. Flattened corn stalks hung in the wire like laundry left in a storm. The house dried out from the ground up. The smell took longer. The chicks did not die. They grew. With an alarming, almost aggressive speed, they swelled from damp yellow puffs into gangly, half-feathered pullets that ate everything they could reach and escaped everything Eli built to contain them. Every morning, he'd find the pen half empty. He'd built the pen in a corner of the barn. Mud floor. Boards nailed tight. Gaps sealed. He was certain he'd closed every gap. He walked the perimeter twice. He nailed things that didn't need nailing. He stood back and declared it secure. The next morning, half the pen was empty. The birds were outside, and they weren't scattered. They weren't running panicked circles in the yard. They were moving, calmly and deliberately, east and uphill, picking their way across the ruined field toward the knob. Eli patched the gaps. Same thing the next morning, and the morning after that. "They're getting out the same place," Nora said, standing at the barn door with her coffee. "I know that." "So you know where they're going?" "The knob, every time." A pause. "Don't you think that's strange?" she said. "I think they're chickens," he said. "I don't spend a lot of time trying to understand the inner logic of chickens." Nora looked at the trail of birds picking across the mud toward the rise. She thought about Mabel. A hen knows where to stand when the water comes. It was Win Pryor who gave her the thread to pull. She came by on the 8th day after the flood, cornbread wrapped in cloth. That particular way she had of arriving exactly when you needed someone to arrive, without having been told you needed it. They sat on the second-floor porch and watched the pullets picking their way up the slope of the knob in the afternoon light. Wynne watched them for a while without saying anything. Then, almost to herself, "Your husband's grandmother used to send me up that rise for blackberries. Said it never flooded, not once in 50 years. A small pause. "Said the old Otto family camped there when the water came, before any of us were farming here." She turned her cup in her hands. "Funny what land remembers." Then she pressed Nora's hand, the way Mabel's friend had pressed Eli's cheek. That particular kind of touch that means I'm handing you something. "Watch what the animals do, child," Wynne said. "They were here before us. They're not guessing." Nora felt something shift in her chest. She didn't say anything. She just looked at the knob. The next morning, she followed the chickens, not to chase them back, not to patch whatever gap they'd found this time. She followed them, across the drying mud, past the ruined fence line, up the gentle slope of the rise through the wild sunflower, and the prairie grass into the tangle of bramble at the top. The pullets were already there when she arrived, and the knob was alive. That was the thing, the word that kept coming to her as she stood there in the early light, watching the birds work the ground. Alive. The flood that had killed the corn had drowned every insect in the bottomland, washed out every kitchen garden, left the low places silent and stripped. But up here, 8 feet above the high water mark, the ground had not been touched. Grasshoppers sprang from the grass in clouds as the pullets moved through. Crickets and beetles worked the leaf litter under the brambles. The wild sunflowers were heading out full of seed. The prairie grass had gone golden with it, and the birds gorged. They moved through the knob like a hired crew. Systematic, efficient, completely at home on ground nobody had ever thought to use for anything. Nora crouched at the edge of the bramble and pushed her fingers into the soil. Dark, loose, cool, never compacted by plow or hoof, never drowned, threaded through with deep roots that had been doing their work for decades without any human being bothering to notice. And then she noticed something else. At the base of the rise, where the slope gentled out before it met the flat, there was a seep, a low, wet patch in the grass. She pushed through to it and crouched down and touched the water. Cold, clean. A spring, small and steady. The birds had already found it. 3 of them were drinking from it right now, completely unbothered by her presence. They had found the water. They had found the food. They had found the shelter, the brambles, she realized, watching 2 pullets tuck themselves into the thorny cover at the edge of the rise. Safe from everything that flies or runs at ground level. The thorns were not an obstacle. They were a wall. The birds had not been escaping. They had been moving in. She stood up slowly and looked at the whole knob. 3 acres, a gentle dome above the flat, the brambles on top, the spring at the base, the grass going to seed all along the south face. She did the math Eli hadn't thought to do. 86 birds eating their fill every single day on food that cost the Callaways nothing. on ground that needed no plowing, no irrigation, no maintenance of any kind. On ground that had just survived a flood that killed everything within a half-mile of it in every direction. Every egg those birds eventually laid would be nearly pure profit. She stood there for a long time. Then she went back to the house to find Eli. "Come up with me," she said. He was repairing a section of fence, which was something to do, which was the main thing going for it. "I'm working. Come up to the knob." "Nora, I've walked that rise 100 times. There's nothing up there but Eli." Something in her voice stopped him. He put down the wire. They walked up together in the late afternoon light. The pullets scattered a little at their approach, then settled back. The sun was going orange over the river, the shadows long, and Eli stood on the top of the knob and turned a slow circle. She watched him see it, watched the farmer in him start working, the part of him that couldn't look at ground without calculating it. She watched his eyes move across the south face where the birds had stripped the grasshoppers clean. She watched him crouch and push his fingers into the soil the way she had earlier alone. She watched his face change. "This is good ground," he said, slowly, like he was surprised to hear himself say it. "How is this good ground?" "It's been here the whole time," Nora said. "Too small to plow, too high to water. For corn." He stood up, turned another circle. "It's worthless for corn." "For corn," she said. "Yes." He looked at the birds, at the spring, at the brambles, back at the birds. "For these," he stopped. "For these birds," she said. "It's a farm." He stood still for a moment. She let him stand still. The river caught the last of the orange light to the east. Below them, the ruined bottomland sat quiet and black. And up here, on the knob, 86 pullets moved through the grass with the efficiency of something that had always known exactly where it belonged. "August still thinks we should sell them," Eli said. Not an argument, just placing it on the table between them. "August has been flooded out 4 times, Nora said, "and every time he's rebuilt in the same low place." A pause. "We'd need to build up here," Eli said. "Off the ground, everything off the ground." He was already looking at the angles, where the coop would sit, where the run would go, where the spring fed out. She could see him building it in his head. "Yes," she said, "it's only 3 acres. It's 3 acres that didn't flood." Another pause. Longer this time. "Your grandmother called this place the Knob," Nora said. "She never tried to clear it, never tried to plow it. She just called it by name and left it alone." She looked at him. "Don't you think she knew?" Eli was quiet. Below them, the light was going, the bottoms going dark and still. And up here, the birds were settling into the brambles for the night. tucking themselves into the thorny cover with small, satisfied sounds, finding their places, already home. "One more week," Eli said finally. "You said that was my line." "One more week," he said again, "and then we figure out what we're building." He didn't sound like a man making a reluctant concession. He sounded like a man who had just seen something he hadn't been looking for, and found it anyway. They built the first pen the following week. Scrap lumber from the flood debris. Chicken wire Eli had been saving toward a coop he'd never gotten around to. They set it on the south face of the knob where the birds already gathered in the morning. They built it up off the ground on short legs, Nora's insistence, after what Wynne had said, after what the spring told her about where water went when it moved. Even a freak rain couldn't pool inside. The pullets took to it immediately, and Eli, who had spent 14 months trying to impose his will on 40 flat acres that fought him at every turn, found himself doing something new. He started watching the birds before he built anything. He set the roosts where they already roosted. He left the dust-bathing patches bare and loose. He ran the low fence to include the shade of the brambles at midday. He stopped planning first. He watched first and built second. It was a different way of working. It was, in fact, the hardest thing he'd done in 14 months. Harder than draining the low corner. Harder than mending fence after the flood. Because those things required effort. This required something else. The willingness to admit that something smaller and feathered and apparently unconcerned with his opinion knew something he hadn't figured out yet. He found that he didn't mind as much as he'd expected. Nora watched him figure that out too. She kept her own counsel about it. She opened the second ledger pencil, careful columns, little sketches of the knob with the pens marked in, and she started keeping track. Egg counts when the time came, forage observations, notes on behavior, on weather, on which way the birds moved, on which kind of morning. She titled it in small letters at the top of the first page, "The High Ground Flock." She didn't show it to anyone yet. It was too new, too much like hope. And hope was a thing you kept quiet about until it had proven it could stand on its own. Below the knob, the ruined fields sat still and black in the summer heat. Above the birds worked the south face from first light to last, and the knob held them, dry, safe, high above everything the river had thought to take, the way it had always held everything that had the sense to climb it. July came in hot and stayed that way, and the Callaway farm split itself into two worlds. Below the knob, the ruined bottomland dried slowly in the heat. The cracked black mud where the corn had been. The flood line stained on the house stilts like a watermark on old paper. The silence of a year's work gone. Not dramatic silence, just the ordinary quiet of a field that has nothing left to say. Above on the knob, something was happening that neither of them had a word for yet. Not a plan, They hadn't planned any of it, not a business. Too small and too new, and too much held together with salvage lumber and instinct. Something between those two things. A living thing taking shape on 3 acres of high ground that had been waiting patient as anything for someone to finally notice it was there. Eli was up on the knob every morning by first light. He'd stopped fighting the place. That was the change in him. The thing Nora noticed first and said nothing about because some changes need silence around them to set properly. He moved differently up there, less like a man imposing himself on ground, more like a man in conversation with it. He watched the birds before he touched a nail. He built where they already were. He fixed what they showed him was broken, and the knob in return started looking like something. A second pin went up mid-July. Then a proper raised coop set on legs south-facing the roof, angled to catch the breeze that came up the slope every afternoon. Nora's idea, the angle. She'd noticed the birds always gathered on the east side of the rise when the afternoon got heavy and still. Chasing the air. She told Eli. He adjusted the roofline without comment. That was its own kind of conversation. The summer had its rhythms now. Eli built. Nora tracked. The birds ranged and foraged and grew with the particular confidence of creatures who had always understood exactly where they stood. And Nora kept the second ledger, pencil columns, careful numbers, little sketches of the knob with the pens marked in at the edges. She noted the forage patterns, the weather, the way the flock moved on cloudy mornings versus clear ones, the week the wild sunflowers peaked, the week the prairie grass went to seed, the high ground flock. She hadn't shown it to anyone yet. It was still too much like something fragile, the kind of thing you keep in your pocket until you're sure it won't shatter when the air hits it. The first egg appeared on a Thursday morning in the first week of August. Nora found it in the bramble tucked into a shallow scrape. One of the older pullets had made herself. Brown, warm, perfectly ordinary in every way that an egg can be ordinary. Except the yolk. She cracked it into the pan that morning and stopped. The yolk was the color of a marigold. Not pale yellow, not the wan, uncertain color of a hen fed on bought grain and kept in a low coop. This was deep orange gold, the color of something that had been eating well in the sunshine for months, the color of a hen that had spent her summer working the south face of a knob, gorging on grasshoppers and sunflower seed and whatever else the wild ground offered up for free. Nora stood at the stove and looked at it for a long moment. Then she called Eli in from the yard. He looked at the pan, looked at the yolk, looked at her. "That's an egg," he said. "That," she said, "is the beginning of something." He squinted at it. "It's very yellow." "Orange," she said. "It's orange Eli." He ate it without further comment, which was his way of agreeing she was right. The flood had taken everything in the bottomland, every kitchen garden for miles, every low chicken yard, every flock kept in the old way, close to the ground, close to the water. The families of Harwick County had spent the summer rebuilding their lives from mud up, and most of them were doing it without eggs because there were no eggs to be had, except from the Callaways, who were inexplicably sitting on top of a knob with 86 hens coming into lay and no competition within a day's ride. Widow Crane figured this out first. She came for eggs the second week of August, rode over in her wagon, knocked on the door, asked Nora straight out if she had any to sell. Nora sold her 2 dozen and felt the particular pleasure of a transaction that helped both sides equally. Widow Crane went home and told everyone she met about the yolks. Marigold, she said, like a sunset. Like something you'd paint if you were trying to show someone what an egg was supposed to look like before everyone forgot. The hens of the bottomland fed on bought corn in low, dark coops laid pale and watery eggs. Weak things, the kind of egg you crack into a pan and wonder if the hen was apologizing. The Callaway hens fed on the wild knob-laid eggs that people started asking for by name. By the 3rd week of August, Nora was selling 4 dozen a week at the mercantile in town and another 2 dozen straight from the farm. Cash money, small amounts, steady amounts, real amounts. She opened the ledger every evening and wrote the numbers in. And the numbers for the first time since the wedding were going in the right direction. Not enough. Not nearly enough. The gap between what they had and what they owed was still wide enough to fall into. But the gap was narrowing. Slowly. The way a wound closes slowly when you stop doing things to reopen it. Nora let herself feel it. Just a little. Just at the edges. Then Eli came home from town with a gray face and didn't speak until he'd put up the horse. She was at the kitchen table when he came in. The second ledger open in front of her. She looked up and saw his face and closed the ledger. She waited. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily and put both hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. Holt sold the note, he said. She didn't say anything. The bank's been bought by a company out of Omaha. New owners want the whole stretch of bottomland, Harwick to the county line. He swallowed. They've already got the Colton place and the Reed farm. Both of them sold last month. The room was very quiet. There's a man coming, Eli said. Name of Donahue. He manages acquisitions for the company. A pause. He'll be here Tuesday. Nora looked at the table. She was doing the math. Instantly and involuntarily the way she always did math. Mortgage balance. Egg income per week. Weeks to first frost. The number of eggs it would take to close the gap before the deadline. The numbers didn't like each other. What's the deadline? She asked. First hard frost. Eli looked at her. Pay the note in full or they take the land, all 40 acres. Another pause. The knob, too, he said, quietly, like that part was the worst part, because he knew by now that it was. She stood up. She went to the window. Outside, up the slope, the hens were moving in the late afternoon light. Small white shapes against the gold of the knob. unhurried, certain of their ground. She stood at the window for a long time. Eli said nothing, which was the kindest thing he could have done. Mr. Donahue arrived on Tuesday in a buggy too clean for the cart track. He was not the villain Nora had braced herself for. That was the first surprise, and in some ways, the worst one. He was a tall man in a gray suit, somewhere between 50 and 60, with a face that had settled past handsome into something more useful, composed, pleasant. The face of a man who had delivered difficult news enough times that he'd learned to make it sound like reason. He stood in the yard and did not look at the knob. That was the second thing Nora noticed. He looked at the ruined bottomland. He gestured at the flood stain on the house stilts. He spoke in the measured tones of someone making a sensible case to sensible people. "You've been dealt a hard hand," he said, "and I won't pretend otherwise. The river floods. It has always flooded. It will flood again. A family can break itself fighting that water for a generation and leave their children nothing but debt and mud." He opened the leather folio under his arm. "My company intends to do what individual farmers cannot. Drain the whole bottom, levee it properly, make it safe for the next 100 years. But that requires the whole stretch of land. One holdout and the scheme fails." He named a figure. It was enough to clear the mortgage, a little extra. It was also Nora knew a fraction of what the land was worth in a dry year. "And if we don't sell," she said, "not Eli, her." Donahue looked at her, adjusted slightly, the way men sometimes did when they realized she was the one they needed to speak to. "Then the note comes due at frost," he said. "If you can't pay it, the land transfers anyway, for nothing. I'd rather pay you something." A small pause. "But the outcome is the same either way, Mrs. Calloway. I'm simply offering you the dignity of walking away with something in your pocket." He set a card on the porch railing. "Think on it, but don't think long. Frost comes early some years." He climbed into the buggy. He drove away, and the dust of the cart track hung gold in the afternoon light long after he was gone. Nora picked up the card. She looked at it. She put it in her apron pocket without showing it to Eli. She turned and looked at the knob, and she thought about how Donahue had looked at this farm. What he'd seen, the flood stain, the ruined fields, the mortgage. All of it true. All of it the kind of evidence that built a reasonable case. He had not looked at the knob. Not really. His eyes had passed over it the way eyes pass over things they've already decided don't matter. Waste ground, she could hear him thinking. Weeds on a small hill. He had not climbed it. And she thought, that's the whole thing, isn't it? Every person who had ever looked at this farm and seen only what was wrong with it had done the same thing. Had stood in the low place and looked around and made their calculations from the flood line. Not one of them had climbed the rise. That night she sat with the ledger, egg income, current rate, best case projection through October, the figure that would clear the note by first frost. She ran it 4 ways, then a 5th, because the 5th might be different. It wasn't, even with every hen laying, even selling every egg to every family in the county, even if prices went up because there was no other source for miles. Not enough, not by frost. The egg business was real. It was growing. It was the first thing she'd built from nothing that was actually working. But it was a thing built for the long, slow climb of years, not for 9 weeks. She closed the ledger. She sat in the dark, and slowly in the silence, a different shape began to form. Not eggs, what they knew, because the eggs were just the evidence, the proof of a thing. The thing itself was what they'd figured out over the course of 1 ruined summer on 3 acres nobody had wanted. How to read the ground, how to find the rise, how to build up off the dirt, how to let the birds do what birds already know how to do. Every flooded-out family in Harwick County was trying to figure out how to survive the next one. They'd all lost something to the river this summer. They all knew it would come back. The Callaways had figured out how to live above it. What if that was worth more than eggs? She opened the ledger to a fresh page. She picked up the pencil. And she began to write. Not numbers this time. Words. Plain and careful and real. A full account of everything. How to find the high ground on a bottomland farm. How to build pens that stayed dry. How to let a flock forage free on native ground. The spring, the brambles, the way the birds moved the morning before a storm. She wrote through the lamp oil, and when the light guttered, she sat in the dark a while longer. The high ground flock, that was what she'd call it. Half in earnest, and half in something harder than hope. Knowing a thing and selling it are different animals entirely, and the second one nearly broke them. Nora started carefully. She went to the families she knew best first. The Sutters, 2 farms north, who had lost their chicken yard to the June flood and hadn't rebuilt yet. Old Sutter listened to her from the doorway with his arms crossed and his face giving nothing away. She explained the breeding stock, a setting of fertile eggs from the high ground flock, a started pullet or 2 for families that wanted a quicker start, and with every bird a copy of her written account. The method, the whole thing. He listened. He nodded. He said he'd think on it, which meant no for now, but not a closed door. She went to the Harlan family, the Brennans, the widow Marsh, 2 farms east. Some of them were interested, some were not, but the numbers she came home with were not the numbers she needed. Not even close. And then August Pryor opened his mouth. Not maliciously. That was the thing that made it so hard to be angry about. He hadn't meant harm. He'd simply done what August Pryor had always done. He'd said what was in his head at a volume audible to anyone within 30 feet. He was standing outside the mercantile in town. Nora wasn't there. She only heard about it afterward from 3 different people, which meant it had spread the way things spread in small counties. August had been talking to someone. Anyone. August was always talking to someone. "That Calloway woman selling chickens to folks who just lost their farms," he'd said. "Some pamphlet, too, about high ground. What's a chicken going to do for a man losing his land? What's a piece of paper going to do?" He hadn't said it with cruelty. He'd said it with the honest bewilderment of a man who had looked at the situation and found it genuinely confusing. But by the time it reached the rest of the county, it had curdled. By the time it came back to Nora, it had become something else entirely. The Calloway woman was selling false hope to desperate people, taking their last dollars for birds and pamphlets, profiting from her neighbor's misery while her own farm was failing, and underneath all of it, the splinter of truth that made it stick. Who were they to charge for something they'd found by accident? What gave them the right? Widow Crane came on a Friday. She had been Nora's best advocate in the county since the first marigold yoke. She had told everyone. She had sent people to the farm. She had been in the quiet way of women who know how to make things happen without appearing to do anything at all invaluable. She came on Friday and she was cool. Not cold, not cruel. Widow Crane was not built for cruelty. But there was a careful distance in her manner that had not been there before. "I need to ask you something directly," she said. "Go ahead," Nora said. "Are you selling those birds and that pamphlet to families who've already lost everything, charging money to people who can't afford to lose more?" A silence. "I'm selling breeding stock and a method that works," Nora said, "at a fair price. To people who are desperate. To people who need what we have." "Is there a difference?" Widow Crane said. Not unkindly, genuinely. The question of someone who was trying to decide what she believed. Nora didn't have an answer that was better than the question. That was the worst of it. Donahue came back the following Tuesday. He'd heard, of course. A county this size with the situation this particular, of course he'd heard. He came in the same clean buggy. He stood in the same yard. And he was, if anything, more pleasant than before. Which made Nora's skin crawl. "I understand there's been some hard feeling in town," he said, "about your chicken enterprise." He said it gently, the way you might say something true to someone you're pretending to feel sorry for. That's the trouble with schemes, Mrs. Calloway. Even well-intentioned ones. They make people look grasping when all they're really trying to do is survive. He paused. "Take the offer. Be done with it. Walk away with your good name and enough money to start somewhere that doesn't flood." He'd raised the figure slightly. Nora heard the number. She heard the gentleness in his voice. And underneath the gentleness, she heard the thing he wasn't saying. "I already know how this ends." "Thank you," she said, "for coming by." He tipped his hat. He drove away again, and Nora stood in the yard with his card still in her apron pocket, and a second card now sitting on the porch railing, and the stack of unsold pamphlets on the kitchen table and a deadline that was no longer abstract. It was frost close. You could smell it at night now. That evening, Eli did the arithmetic one more time. He spread it all out on the table between them. Egg income, projected sales, the figure that would close the note, the figure they were still short of by enough to matter. We could take his money, Eli said. He said it the way you say something that has to be said. Not because you want it, because leaving it unsaid is its own kind of dishonesty. Clear the note, walk away with something, find land somewhere higher up, somewhere the river doesn't reach. He looked at her. The knob is 3 acres, Nora. You can't pay a mortgage on 3 acres of chickens. We don't know that, she said. We've got 9 weeks and not enough eggs. We've got 9 weeks, she said. And we haven't tried everything yet. He was quiet. She was quiet. Outside, the hens were settled in their high brambles. That small, satisfied sound they made. That absolute certainty of their own right place. What haven't we tried? Eli said. She looked at the stack of unsold pamphlets with their careful handwriting and their titles she'd written half in hope and half in stubbornness. Showing them, she said. We've been trying to show you. No, she shook her head. We've been telling them there's a difference. She looked at him. Every family in this county has done the same thing Donahue did. Looked at their farms from the low place and never climbed the rise. Eli waited. We invite them up, she said. All of them. The ones who bought, the ones who didn't, the ones who think we're grasping, and the ones who are just afraid. We bring them up the knob, and we let them stand on dry ground and see it with their own eyes. And say what? Nothing, she said. We don't say anything. The ground says it. He looked at her for a long moment, the lamp between them, his face in the yellow light, the lines of the summer in it, the tired, the something else that wasn't tired. When? He said. 3 weeks, she said, before the autumn rains start. She stopped. She turned to the window. Something in the sky. Not rain yet, but the particular quality of stillness that came before something moved. Nora, Eli said. I know, she said. She'd been watching the birds all summer. She knew what that stillness meant. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark and thought about Donahue, about the careful way he'd used the word scheme, about how it had landed in the part of her that already worried it might be true. Was she selling hope to people who needed certainty? She thought about Mabel's friend, Hush, long enough to hear. She'd been hearing all summer, watching, recording, tracking the birds the way you track something you believe matters. Building the case in a little pencil ledger like the truth would add up if she was patient enough. But that wasn't what the old woman had meant. Was it? She lay in the dark and let herself be very still. Not thinking, not calculating, not running numbers, or planning the gathering, or weighing Donahue's offer against her own stubbornness. Just still. And in the stillness, something came clear that she hadn't been able to see while she was busy being right about everything. The old woman, Win Pryor, even Mabel decades before all of this. They weren't talking about listening to the ground. They were talking about listening to the moment you were actually in, not the moment you were planning for, not the moment you were afraid of. The actual present moment with all its mud and uncertainty and 86 chickens and a husband asleep beside her and a stack of pamphlets that hadn't sold yet and a knob that was still dry at the end of a summer that had tried everything it had. Stop telling the world what you want from it. Hear what it's asking you to do right now. Not in 3 weeks. Now. She went to the window. The knob was a dark shape against the darker sky, the birds invisible in their brambles. But there. She knew they were there, patient as the ground they stood on. She went back to bed. She slept. 2 days later, the sky changed. Not gradually, all at once. The way the sky in the river valley changed when it meant business. The clouds came in low from the northwest, and the light went flat, and the birds, all 86 of them, without any instruction from any human being, moved up the slope of the knob by mid-morning and did not come back down. Nora watched them from the kitchen window, her coffee going cold in her hand. She thought 3 weeks. She'd planned for 3 weeks. She thought the birds aren't guessing. She went to find Eli. The rain started before dawn. Not the gentle kind. Not the kind that apologizes for itself. This came in sideways off the northwest, driving hard against the window glass, and Nora was awake before it fully arrived, because some part of her had been listening for it since the birds moved up the slope 2 days ago. She lay still for a moment in the dark, Eli breathing beside her. The rain loud on the roof. And underneath the rain, underneath everything, the low, patient sound she knew now without having to think about it. The river, moving. She got up without waking him, went to the window. The sky was the particular gray that comes before a gray dawn, and in that half light, she could see the yard. Water, not the killing flood of June, not 4 feet of churning brown, but water, creeping back across the bottomland in the dark. Quiet and certain, and very much there, already past the garden fence, already touching the base of the house stilts. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass. The knob was invisible in the rain, too dark to see it, but she knew it was there, high and dry and holding everything they'd built. The birds already in their brambles, already safe, already on the only ground in this valley that the river had never once managed to reach. And between the house and the knob, water. She stood at the window and let the full weight of it settle on her. The county wasn't ready. That was the thing she'd been trying to fix with a gathering and a pamphlet and a careful 3-week plan. The families who'd rebuilt their stores of winter feed and seed corn after the June flood had done it the only way they knew. The low way, the familiar way, the way their parents had done it and their grandparents before them. Because the low places were all they knew. Because no one had climbed the rise. Because she had run out of time to show them. She felt it then, the full, cold weight of being right too late. We figured it out, she thought, and it doesn't matter. The water came before anyone would listen. Eli appeared in the doorway behind her. He looked at the yard. He looked at the water. He looked at her face in the glass. He didn't say anything, which was its own kind of mercy. "The Sutters stored their winter grain last week," she said. "I saw the wagon." "I know. In the low barn." "I know Nora." She turned from the window. "The Brennans just finished stacking their seed corn. The widow Marsh rebuilt her root cellar in the same spot it was before the flood." She stopped. "All of it in the low places, because the low places are all they've ever known." Eli was quiet. "They're losing it right now," she said. "In the dark, while they're still asleep, or standing at their own windows staring at it." "The note's due in less than 2 weeks," Eli said. Carefully, not unkindly, just honestly. The way he'd learned to be honest with her this summer, without it being a weapon. "I know that." "We can't make the note if we spend the next week." "I know that too." She picked up her coat from the hook by the door. He watched her. "Nora." "We can't make them believe us with a pamphlet," she said. "We tried that." She pulled the coat on. "We can't make them believe us with the meeting. We planned that and ran out of time." She looked at him. "But we can show them. Show them what the waters—" "We don't wait for them to come see the high ground." She was already reaching for her boots. "We bring the high ground to them." A pause. "We bring them up the knob. Today. Now. Everything the water can ruin, we help them move it. Before it's gone." Eli stood in the doorway for a moment. She could see him calculating, the same way she'd been calculating. Except she'd already come out the other side of the calculation, and she was standing here with her boots half-laced and her coat on, and the rain driving against the window, and 86 birds dry and safe on the other side of the rising water. He went to get his coat. They went out into it. Eli took the rowboat across the flooded section of the cart track. Nora took the wagon along the one stretch of road still above water, the long way around the way that added 20 minutes, and didn't matter because 20 minutes was what they had. She went to the Sutters first, because old Sutter was the hardest one, the most stubborn, the most likely to look at her standing in the rain on his porch and decide she'd lost her mind. If she could turn the Sutters, the rest would follow. She knocked. He opened the door in his undershirt, suspenders hanging, the face of a man who had not expected visitors at dawn in a rainstorm. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Bring your feed," she said. "Your seed." your tools, anything the water can ruin. We've got dry ground on the knob, 3 acres of it, never flooded in 50 years, and today it's yours." He stared at her. "Free," she said. A silence, the rain between them. "Free," he repeated. Nothing, not a cent. He looked past her at the yard, at the water creeping in from the east, at his low barn where the winter grain was stacked exactly where it had always been stacked, and where the water was going to be in approximately 2 hours if the river kept moving. He looked back at her. "Why?" he said, not a soft question, a hard one. The question of a man who had learned that free things usually cost you something you didn't know you had. She could have said a lot of things. She said the true thing. "Because we figured it out and we should have shown you sooner. And we didn't. And this is the only way we have left to fix that." Another silence. Old Sutter looked at her for a long time. Then he turned back into the house. "Dorothea," he called. "Get the boys up." It was the free that did it. Every door she knocked on that morning, she watched it happen. The moment she said free. Not cheap, not fair price, not at cost. Free. The suspicion cracked, because a swindler doesn't stand in the rain at dawn and give things away. A person running a scheme doesn't show up at your door in a storm with mud on her boots and water dripping from her hat brim and offer you the only dry ground for miles without asking for anything in return. A person like that has already decided something, and that decision costs them nothing to share. After the Sutters, it went faster, the way a dam gives, not all at once. First a seep, then a crack, then the whole thing moving. Old Sutter's oldest boy helped her hitch the next load while his father started for the Brennans. The Brennans knew the Widow Marsh. The Widow Marsh knew 4 other families she sent her youngest running to on foot in the rain while she helped load the wagon herself. Nora drove. Eli rode, back and forth between the knob and the bottomland all through that gray streaming morning. Wagon loads and boat loads. Sacks of seed grain that weighed as much as a man. Barrels of winter feed. Plows and harrows and harness leather. Crates of tools. A trunk of winter clothes from the Widow Marsh's bedroom. 2 young pigs complaining bitterly about the boat. The pigs were Eli's idea. She was not going to give him a hard time about it. The knob filled up. The high ground that nobody had wanted became the most valuable piece of land in Harwick County by 9 o'clock in the morning, because it was the only ground that was still dry. And on it sat the saved wealth of a dozen farms, stacked and covered and standing above everything the river was trying to take. The birds were not pleased about this. They had been displaced from their yard by the chaos and had opinions about it. Loud ones. They paced the upper edge of their run, fussed at the humans carrying things through their territory, scolded a man from the Brennan farm who walked too close to the coop without announcing himself. Then, having made their position clear, they retreated to the high brambles. They arranged themselves in a line along the top, and they watched. 86 white hens watching the human beings below them finally do the obvious sensible thing. Get up out of the water. Widow Crane came at mid-morning. Nora didn't see her arrive. She was at the bottom of the slope helping an older woman named Hester balance a box of preserves while her husband managed a crate of tools. And when she looked up, Widow Crane was just there, standing at the base of the knob, looking up at it. She was watching Eli in the rowboat out in the middle of the flooded cart track, transferring another family's seed corn from their wagon to his, soaked to the sternum. Not asking for anything, not explaining himself, just doing the work. Nora watched Widow Crane watch him. Saw the moment something shifted in the older woman's face. Widow Crane walked to the nearest pile of sacks waiting to go up the slope. She bent down. She picked one up. She started carrying. She didn't say anything. Not to Nora. Not to anyone. She just carried the sack up the slope and came back for another one. That was it. That was all of it. No apology, no explanation, no moment where she took Nora's hands and said, "I was wrong and I'm sorry." Just a sack on her back and another one after that. Nora understood it perfectly. Some apologies are made with words because words are all that's available. And some apologies are made with your body in the rain, carrying things that need to be carried. Widow Crane was the second kind of person. Nora had always liked her for exactly that reason. She just hadn't known it until now. August Pryor came at noon. She hadn't expected him. He'd sold to Donahue 3 weeks ago. He and Wynne were packing the house, getting ready to go. He had made his peace with leaving, or something close enough to peace that it looked the same from the outside. But his winter grain was still in the low barn, and the low barn was taking on water. He came up the cart track with his team, both horses blowing hard from the pace he'd pushed them. He pulled up at the base of the knob and climbed down from the wagon and looked at what had assembled itself on the high ground. 12 families worth of everything, stacked and covered and dry, and Nora Calloway directing traffic in the rain like she'd been born to it. He stood there for a moment. Then he started unloading his own wagon. Eli came up from the boat landing and took the other side of a grain barrel without being asked. They moved it up the slope together. At the top, passing each other on the path, August stopped. He set down his end. He looked at the ground under his feet, dark and solid and dry. He looked at the coop on its legs, the brambles, the birds watching from the high cover. He looked out over the valley, the brown water creeping across the bottomland below, his own farm somewhere in that water. 50 years I farmed these bottoms, he said, not looking at Eli, just saying it into the air. Never once climbed this hill. Then he picked up his end of the barrel again. He didn't say anything else. He didn't have to. The river crested that afternoon. It came up to within 2 feet of the June line. not the killing flood, but enough. Enough to swallow the low barns and the root cellars and all the places where the county had always kept the things it couldn't afford to lose. But this year, those things weren't in the low places. They were on the knob, all of it, dry and safe, and 8 feet above the water. The saved winter of 12 families, watched over by 86 hens who had known this was the right place from the very first morning they'd walked up here, back in June, when everyone thought they were just escaping. Donahue came the next morning. The water was still high but receding. The cart track was soup. His buggy moved slowly, and when he came around the last curve and the knob came into view, he stopped the horse. He sat in the buggy for a moment, looking, because what he saw was not what he had expected to see. The knob was full of people, not desperate people, not people who had spent the night losing everything and were standing in the ruins of it. These were families who had lost nothing, families who were moving through the high ground, checking their stores, talking to each other, making the particular kind of noise that people make when they have just been through something hard and come out the right side of it. They were dry. Their grain was dry. Their seed was dry. And they were looking at Nora Calloway with the particular warmth of people who know exactly who reached into the water and pulled them out. Donahue got down from the buggy. He walked up the slope. He passed Eli, who looked at him and said nothing. He passed old Sutter, who looked at him and said nothing. He kept walking until he reached the top of the knob and could see the whole valley spread below him. The water, the flooded bottomland, the farms standing in it, and up here, dry, everything. He understood it in one look. He understood it the way a careful man understands when the ground has shifted under a plan. Not with anger, not with argument, with the quiet recognition of someone who has just seen something that changes the calculation entirely. He had been buying desperate people cheap because desperate people had no options. But these people weren't desperate anymore. They had seen with their own eyes that the bottoms could be survived, that you didn't need a drainage company from Omaha, that you didn't need to sell out and leave, that you needed 3 acres of high ground and the sense to use it. And the Callaways had just shown the whole county exactly where both of those things were. One by one, the families told him. Old Sutter first, straight and simple. We're staying. Then the Brennans, then the widow Marsh, then Hester's husband, who had barely spoken 10 words all morning, and chose these as his 10. You can keep driving. We've made up our minds. Donahue stood at the top of the knob and heard it from each of them. Without the full stretch of bottomland, his drainage scheme was nothing. One holdout and the whole plan fell apart. He knew that. He'd known it from the beginning. It was why he'd moved the way he had. Why he'd been so careful, so reasonable, so generous with his framing. He just hadn't accounted for a woman who would go out in the rain before dawn and give everything away for free. He folded the leather folio. He stood there for a moment, and then he looked at Nora. Not the professional look, not the composed and reasonable look, just a look. She held it. "My father farmed the bottoms," he said quietly. 20 miles south of here. Lost everything in the flood of '71. He paused. "I was 9 years old." She waited. "I spent 30 years telling myself no small farmer could make it through the river alone." His voice was even, careful, but something underneath it that hadn't been there before. That the only way to survive this valley was to consolidate, engineer it, take the scale of the problem out of individual hands. He looked out at the water. "I believed that," he said. "I want you to know I believed it." Nora said nothing. "Looks like I was wrong," he said. He picked up the folio. He walked back down the slope. He climbed into the buggy, and he drove away down the cart track, turning back to mud, and the sound of the wheels faded, and that was the last time Harwick County saw Mr. Donahue. Nobody cheered. Nobody marked the moment. The families of the Bottoms just kept moving through the knob, checking on their things. Which was exactly right. It was old Sutter who started it. He was standing near his grain sacks, hands in his pockets, watching the water below do its slow retreat. And he said it the way he said most things, straight into the air, without particular ceremony. "That woman saved my whole winter." A pause. For nothing. He reached into his coat and brought out a worn leather poke, and he set it on the nearest flat surface. "I aim to make that right." What happened next was not charity. Nobody called it that, and nobody would have stood for it if they had. The families of Harwick County had their own long understanding of dignity and what it required. They had their own accounting of debts and what it meant to pay them. They had barn raisings. They had harvest exchanges. They had the long memory of who had shown up when and with what. This was the same thing, just assembled faster than usual, on a wet knob in September with the river still receding below them. Old Sutter's poke went on the surface and didn't stay there long because others added to it. Cash money, what there was of it after the summer. Not much from anyone, enough from everyone. Then the other kind of payment began. The Brennan family wanted breeding stock. 4 settings of fertile eggs from the high ground flock at a fair price freely agreed on. Fair meaning both sides nodded at the number and meant it. The widow Marsh wanted pullets. Started birds old enough to have proven themselves on the knob. She'd rebuild her flock the right way this time. The highway. Hester's husband had a strong back and a slow winter coming. He offered labor, help building proper coops on whatever farms wanted them. The raised kind, the right kind, and Widow Crane, Widow Crane picked up a stack of the unsold pamphlets from the pile Nora had carried up the knob that morning, thinking she'd need them for the gathering that never happened. She looked at them. She looked at Nora. "I know every family in this county," she said, "and I know which ones are thinking about leaving and which ones just need a reason to stay." She tucked the pamphlets under her arm. "Leave these to me." Nora looked at her. "I said some things," Widow Crane said, "that I should have thought more carefully about before I said them." A pause. "I'll say different things now." That was the apology, fully delivered. Nothing added. Nora took it the way it was offered. "Thank you," she said. It didn't all arrive at once. Money never does. It moved like the river in reverse, slow at first, picking up as it went. The cash from the knob that morning, the egg orders paid ahead, the labor promised. The pamphlets going out into the county with Widow Crane's personal endorsement, which was worth more than any advertisement Nora could have written herself. Through the last weeks of September, it came in. Nora tracked every bit of it. The second ledger filling up, numbers going in the right direction the way she'd watched them all summer, except faster now. Faster than eggs alone could have managed. Faster than she'd dared plan for when she sat up late with the lamp guttering and tried to make the math work 5 different ways. The math was working. She checked it twice. She checked it a 3rd time because she didn't trust herself not to want it to be true badly enough to make it look true. It was true. The last week of September was cold and bright and smelled of wood smoke and the particular dryness that comes before the first frost. Nora laid it all out on the table. Every number, every payment, every trade counted at its cash value. She added it. She sat back. She slid the ledger across the table to Eli. He looked at the total. He looked up at her. "Is this right?" he said. "I checked it 3 times. He looked at it again. "This is enough," he said. "It's enough." A silence. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say. The silence of people who have so much to say that none of it will fit through the door at once, so they sit with it and let it be what it is. "I'll ride in tomorrow," Eli said. "I know," she said. "He left before first light. The frost came that morning, first real frost of the year." The knob turned white with it, every blade of grass tipped silver, the brambles glittering in the early light. And the birds came out of their shelter and stood in it with the complete calm of creatures who had survived worse things and knew it. Nora stood at the top of the rise with her coffee. She watched the hens move through the frost-bright grass, leaving small tracks in the white. The coop behind her on its legs. The south-facing windows. The roof line that caught the morning air the way she'd noticed the birds chasing it back in July. Below the bottomland was still, the flood marks on the house stilts, the fields resting, The river at its proper level, now back behind its distance and its patience waiting for the next time. There would be a next time. The river was clear about that. It had always been clear about that. But the knob was dry. It had always been dry. And they knew it now. She looked out at the valley, the neighboring farms, the places where the families had gone back to rebuild after the September water, but differently now. Higher. The Brennan coop already going up on legs, she could see the frame of it from here. Old Sutter had moved his grain storage up the rise behind his farmhouse. Small changes. The kind that don't look like much from a distance until you understand what they mean. They mean we learned something. They mean we won't do it the same way again. She thought about Donahue, not with anger. She'd moved past anger somewhere in the middle of September and hadn't gone back for it. She thought about him with something closer to understanding. A man shaped by a flood he'd survived at 9 years old. A man who'd spent 30 years building a theory around that shape. A theory that wasn't wrong exactly. The river is real. The danger is real. The farmers of the bottoms did need things that individual effort couldn't always provide. He just thought the help had to come from outside, had to come from scale and engineering and capital. He hadn't considered that it might already be there. 3 acres, never flooded, patient as anything, just waiting for someone to climb it. She heard the horse before she saw it, the sound carrying in the cold air across the bottomland. She turned. Eli, coming home. She watched him ride up the last stretch of the track. He saw her on the knob and raised one hand. She raised hers back. He tied the horse at the post and came up the slope on foot the way she'd watched him learn to come up. Without hurry, paying attention to where he was walking, he reached the top. She looked at him. "Well," she said. "The man counted it twice," Eli said. A pause. Said he'd never seen that much coin arrive all at once from a single farm. "What did you tell him?" "I told him it didn't come from a single farm." She looked at him. He looked at her. And then Eli Calloway sat down on the top rail of the coop that stood on its legs 8 feet above the ground that had once tried to take everything from them. And he laughed. Not the hollow kind, not the kind that covers something harder. The real kind. The kind that comes up from somewhere below the ribs when you've been holding something tight for a long time and you finally get to put it down. Nora sat beside him. The frost on the knob. The birds moving below them unhurried and certain. The river glinting in the distance. The valley stretched out in the cold, bright morning. "She knew we'd have to lose the corn first," Nora said. Eli was quiet for a moment. "Maybe that was the point," he said. "Leave the low field. Leave the knob alone. Let whoever comes next figure out the rest." Nora looked out at the valley. "No one figures out the high ground," she said, "until the low place fails them." Eli looked at her sideways. "That's a hard thing to know about people," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." The birds moved through the frost below them, steady and purposeful, as if they had nowhere else to be and no reason to hurry, and all the time in the world, which from where they stood they did. 86 white hens, walking up the same worn path to the same dry rise, not escaping anymore, just going home. Some people spend a whole life telling the world what they want it to be, pouring their effort into ground that fights them, planning against outcomes they can't control, insisting loudest when they're most afraid. The lucky ones learn something different. Not to stop working, not to stop caring, but to stop before the first move, to stand still for one moment and feel which way the ground is sloping, to hush long enough to hear what it's asking. Nora Calloway learned that from a flood she didn't ask for, from 86 chickens she didn't plan on, from a hill that had been sitting on the edge of her life for 14 months, waiting for her to look at it properly. She learned it the hard way, which is, as it turns out, the only way it sticks.